While reflecting on today's gospel, I found it hard to sort of shake the thought of how there's a great deal of control that is rampant in the world around us today. Take, for example, the avowed greed of a select few in a position to manipulate the valuation of junk bonds and subpar mortgages that precipitated the global financial crisis in 2007. That crisis wiped out the life savings of millions in North America alone. Could it be that social struggles with the individual right to bear arms, which we hear so much about, is actually all about personal control? If I've got an M16 strapped to my chest, who's in control? And it could be those that advocate the personal bearing of arms, particularly in public, are actually advocating for control. How many millions of people have been adversely affected by the actions of a few? And how do these individuals find themselves in a position to be in control of the situation to their own advantage? Now, what is it about this human attraction to control? Control over events, control over governments, control over wealth, or control over each other? What is it about this desire for control that's so pervasive? Is this fatal attraction something that's intrinsic to our darker side as human beings, or is it perhaps something less of an impenetrable evil and more of an opportunity for us as a Christian community, which I'll elaborate on a little bit later? It seems to me that Jesus alone understood this paradox of the power of love in a world that thirsts apparently for control. I mean, I can imagine him serving as a marriage counselor, sitting around the room with a couple and turning to the man and saying, you know, my friend, if you can't control your woman, then you found a good one. In today's Gospel of Matthew, Jesus sets a question and answer stage for the disciples that seems designed to open their eyes to the meaning of his ministry. As the divine Son of God, it was love that he turned to, and not control. It was not directives that drove him. It was invitation, as you're marking his ministry. It's also important, I think, to consider that Jesus' ministry at the time he's talking to the disciples is unfolding in the full public overt rejection by the temple authorities of the day. The Pharisees and Sadducees have already, prior to today's reading, demanded a miracle sign from Jesus, on the face of it to verify the authenticity of his ministry as a prophet, but actually, more insidiously, in the hope of controlling the way in which his mission is perceived by the crowds who have gathered to hear and touch him. In this question and answer period that unfolds, Jesus first asks the disciples for their understanding of the public perception. What does everybody think of this mission we're on? Including that of the temple leaders. From the 12 disciples, he gets a predictable response. A jumbled murmuring of names that list John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, and heaven knows who else that might come to mind as standout leaders and prophets from the Tanakh, the book of the Old Testament. They all knew these books intimately as members of the Jewish community. But then Jesus does what Jesus so beautifully does. He turns the question to them. And he says, okay, that's what they think. Well, who do you say that I am? And the response of the 12 is that it reminds me a little bit of a grade 3 sort of class where the teacher poses the tough question, and about 3/4 to 7/8 of the class all look at the floor at their shoes, kind of hoping that the peppermint patty thing where they don't get asked, and nobody seems to know the answer, but there's always one person in the class who has thought about it, sticks up their hand, and it's Peter. And Peter declares, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And it's at this point in the gospel where the gospel offers the revelation of Jesus' authority and identity as the Messiah, where that authority is the very foundation of the authority wielded by the Christian community and the church at large. It's an authority that's revealed in Jesus in the midst of rejection by the religious hierarchy and general society of the day. And that's important to understand. He has been rejected by the general public. but he's uttered and lived his mission in a way that is true. It's an authority that's critical for us to understand in terms of our own church traditions in the context of a public dialogue concerning our faith, and in the midst of a community around us that, quite frankly, often calls into question our authority to interpret scriptures for everyday life. There's a bunch of people out there who would argue that the church does not have the moral authority to do that. So the text here points to the birth of something important, an idea of what it means to be church and what it means to be a member of the family. It points to the birth of the church. And this birth happens in response to the rejection of Jesus' ministry and his identification as the Son of God by the community at large. It's the key moment where this distinction between the teachings of Jewish authorities and the good news of Jesus' ministry becomes clearly separate. Matthew is the first author in the Gospels to use a word that most interpret to mean just church. It's called ecclesia, it's a Greek word. And it's been used to equate to the church as an institution. But roughly translated, it doesn't mean that. What it means is to be called out. What it means is to be singled out as the one buffalo in a herd of 10,000, that you have been called out to be different. I want you out of the herd, out of the safety of the herd, and I want you to be different. That's what it means to be a member of ecclesia. So, this idea of church or ecclesia is to reject the norm and pursue a different course. It's to be it's a wonderful example of being exactly who you are, and it doesn't matter what the rest of the herd is. Not at all. But in this gospel today, it's not Jesus' intent to backhand or broad-based reject the concept of the people of Israel, not at all, but rather as a new source of identity for the community. It's what he wants to talk about, an identity that takes shape in the revelation of his own mission and ministry. So as a church founded on the divinity of Christ, we are an ecclesia. We are called out. We're asked to be the one picked buffalo in the herd of brown ones. We're called out to consider the way in which we've been baptized to identify with the rejection of our legitimacy to exist. Sink your teeth into that for a minute. We've been baptized into accept the rejection of who we are. The divinity and authority of Christ is inherent to the divinity and authority of the church. Yeah, there's certainly a connection there. The question is, how are we to attest to our faith and in the divine authority of Jesus in the midst of our daily lives? That's the question, and that's the tough part. A response to that question, maybe for ourselves and also the wider community who are skeptical of the divine authority of Jesus, is to stand resolute in the opportunity that comes through rejection. What do I mean by rejection? It means simply that we are called to stand in solidarity with those for whom most others couldn't care less. The poor, the hungry, the sick, and the dispossessed. Do you think those guys that manipulated the stocks on Wall Street in 2007 give a rat's you-know-what about the hungry, the dispossessed, the sick, the lonely? They care about something else. Dollars in their own pocket. And that's what we're confronted with. That's what we are called out to be distinct from. In being called out and responding to this call to be different, we have to be careful to avoid the lure of criminalizing those who find no profit or sympathy in rejecting greed and serving the greater needs of others. We have to be careful. Why? Because through the discipleship of Peter, who is a paradigm for all of our individual gifts and ministries, we are entrusted with the keys to the binding and the loosing of God's purpose, as outlined in the gospel today. We are entrusted with the keys to interpret that revelation and turn it into the work of the church. And that's an awesome responsibility to hold those keys. So stop to consider that responsibility for a second. On the one hand, as holders of the keys, we could behave like prison guards, whose only understanding of holding the keys is to control those who don't hold the keys and submit them to incarceration. On the other hand, there is the holder of the keys who is the redeemer, who approaches a person from the perspective of invitation, where the grace of God is offered, manifest as love for one another, with the object of rehabilitation and redemption, rather than command and control. We have that choice as holders of the keys. A lot has been said about today's gospel in the context of Simon Peter's renaming and the formation of the new community of faith. But is Jesus naming Peter as the rock upon which the ecclesia will be founded to be restricted to a definition and a justification of apostolic succession? This is certainly strongly a Roman tradition, and it's partly our tradition as well. Is it to be restricted to the naming and building of a monumental basilica in downtown Rome, as St. Peter's? I think not. Because Peter, like all of us, stands in the shadow of Jesus' authority and ministry, born as it was and still is in rejection by the world around him. Like us, Peter was gifted with the keys, as stated in today's gospel. That is an invitation to live out one's life in the body of Christ and in the pathetic rejection that comes from service to others. But here's the good news. Each and every one of us is invited to be a kind of locksmith for Jesus. Invited to wield the keys of his revelation and his redemption. And invited to see all of those around us who are otherwise invisible. So my thought for you today is to get out your keys. The keys you've been gifted as a member of the family of God. And go and stick them into the locks and turn the locks of those doors that nobody else will approach or touch. And don't be afraid. As a wise man once said, beginnings are usually scary and endings are very often sad. But it's everything in between that makes it worth it.